The narrator's voice begins, reflecting on how hope can be a luxury in times of crisis. It wasn't the kind of thing you could buy at a convenience store or find neatly wrapped on a shelf. It was something to be earned, to be wrestled from the brutal arithmetic of an existence where every dollar had a purpose, and every purpose was survival. The scene opens on a late summer afternoon in Elijah Carter's neighborhood, the kind of heat that made the air itself feel thick and heavy. The asphalt shimmered with the residue of a recent shower, releasing a damp, earthy smell that mingled with the faint scent of sizzling onions and spices from a distant food truck. The languid rhythm of the neighborhood was broken only by the frustrated grumble of a car engine refusing to turn over a few houses down. Elisha felt the weight of that reality every day. It clung to him, like the humid air, settling deep into the lines of his brow and the weariness in his brown eyes. His day was a simple, brutal loop. A 4 a.m. alarm, a bus ride across town, and an 8-hour shift at a warehouse where he moved boxes until his back ached and his fingers were raw. It was the kind of job that didn't just pay a low wage. It offered no escape, no pathway to a better future. It was just a place to exist, to make enough to keep the lights on and help his sister, Amara, with the bills. The catalyst for his idea wasn't some grand moment of inspiration. It was a simple, painful moment of necessity. At the dinner table, the aroma of a humble pork chop dinner filled the air, a scent that only masked the tension beneath the surface. Amara spoke with a quiet, strained voice about the price of eggs and beef and how the grocery budget was shrinking faster than their savings account. Elijah watched their mother, her expression a careful mask of resignation. It was then that an idea, a concept he had been toying with for months, solidified into a concrete plan. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Elijah spoke his idea out loud for the first time. The words felt fragile in the humid air. He explained how he could create a social media platform, a place where people in the community could share tips on saving money, swap clothes and household items, or even offer their skills for services. He imagined it as a sort of digital community garden, a way to fight back against a system that was making everything unaffordable. His sister, Amara, listened with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of concern and deep-seated skepticism. Her response was not unkind, but it was edged with a weariness born of experience. She reminded him of the bills, of the late notices, and of the reality that they didn't have time for a project that might fail. Her voice, soft yet firm, conveyed her belief that stability, even a painful one, was better than the risk of failure. Then, Malik, his best friend, laughed a bitter laugh. He spoke of how many grand plans he had seen fizzle out in their neighborhood. He told Elisha to be real with himself and to not get his hopes up. His words, a painful echo of the very system they were trying to overcome. He was alone with his idea, with the low hum of the computer and the relentless noise of the city outside. But beneath the suffocating weight of their doubt, a small, stubborn seed had been planted, and it was just beginning to stir. The narrator's voice shifts, reflecting on the heavy burden of responsibility and the quiet, corroding power of doubt. The morning light filtering through Elijah's window was not golden. It was a weak, apathetic gray that did little to warm the room. The ache in his back was a familiar companion, a dull throb that had long since transcended the physical, settling into the very core of his being. He felt it when he sat down, when he stood up, and when his fingers moved across the rough, sticky keys of his laptop, the surfaces worn smooth by 1,000 desperate late nights. He was caught in a cycle of exhausting work and demoralizing failure. The small victories, a few lines of code debugged, a new design element sketched out, were swallowed by the larger, more urgent realities. He would return from his warehouse job, the smell of cardboard and sweat clinging to his skin, to a table piled with bills and late notices. He could almost feel the cold dread of those white envelopes. Amara, with her practical, hardened gaze, would lay out the numbers, her voice low and tight as she recounted the skyrocketing cost of groceries and the unexpected car repair that had drained their small emergency fund. It was a familiar and painful scene, the kind of daily struggle that the media reports often glossed over, the quiet, grinding reality of being part of a working class that had a harder time finding jobs and was paid significantly less than their college-educated peers. Elijah felt it, the weight of statistics he didn't have the words for. A 7.2% unemployment rate for Black Americans, almost double that of white Americans, a disparity that had persisted for decades. He felt the sting of a system where a college degree could mean better pay and job stability, but where the financial barriers to a college education for Black students were greater to begin with. Every time Amara spoke of their financial precariousness, it wasn't just a discussion of numbers. It was a conversation about the history of economic racism and the generational inequality that made wealth accumulation feel like a cruel joke. Her fear wasn't a flaw. It was a symptom of a reality that told her that the system was built to keep them down. The physical toll of his anxiety was as real as the ache in his back. A persistent, metallic taste of fear seemed to linger on his tongue. He would try to work on his platform, but his mind would get stuck on Malik's words, echoing in the quiet room. Don't get your hopes up. It wasn't malice. It was a form of protection born from a lifetime of disappointment. The low point came in a flash of sound and motion. The old, rickety sedan, a symbol of their fragile stability, coughed and died in the middle of a busy street. The sound of the engine sputtering out was a full stop to their world. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs as he stood by the side of the road, the car refusing to start. He watched as his mother, her face etched with a silent, helpless despair, looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It wasn't the car breaking down that was the most painful part. It was the crushing sense of being unable to fix it, of having his hopes and dreams feel insignificant and foolish in the face of a tangible, immediate problem that he had no solution for. He could almost hear the unspoken question in his mother's eyes. When will this end? It was a moment of true despair, a stark realization that no amount of ambition could fight the brutal forces of reality. The turning point in a story is rarely a moment of grand inspiration, the narrator reflects. It is more often a quiet, cold moment of clarity, a silent breaking point where the only path forward is to build a new road with whatever tools are left. For Elijah, this moment arrived not in the garage with the broken car, but in the hush of his mother's kitchen later that evening. She was standing at the sink, washing the few dishes from dinner. The water ran in a thin, hesitant stream, a metaphor for their dwindling resources. He watched her for a long moment, the soft curve of her shoulders, the way she methodically, almost unconsciously, wrung the dishcloth out. Her movements were so tired, so utterly burdened by a silent weight he knew he was a part of. She didn't cry out loud or shout at him in frustration. She simply stood there, a quiet monument to a lifetime of struggle. And for Elijah, that silence was more deafening than any scream. In that moment, a feeling colder and harder than despair settled in his chest. It was a refusal. He refused to let her carry that weight any longer. He refused to let his own weariness become a generational inheritance. The hopelessness that had filled him evaporated, replaced by a fierce and unyielding resolve. He thought of his idea not as a dream anymore, but as a weapon. He would not just build a platform to help others, he would build a way out for his family, a way to fight back against the invisible hand that kept them all chained to the ground. His hands, which had been raw from moving boxes, now felt the cool, smooth keys of his laptop. The blue light from the screen was no longer a harsh, lonely beacon in the dark. It felt like a torch. He worked through the night, the only sounds the relentless tapping of his fingers and the low hum of the computer fan. His focus was so intense that the city outside faded away. He was no longer just a young man trying to make it. He was a creator, a reality builder, a person with the power to rewrite the narrative of his family and his community. The lines of code, the design elements he was building, they were his protest, his battle cry against a world that had tried to silence him. And then, with the first light of dawn creeping through the window, he finished. He had built a simple, clean landing page and a short, heartfelt video. He looked at the words he had written and at his own face on the screen, his brown eyes no longer showing weariness, but a quiet, burning fire. His heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He had done all he could. The rest was up to the world. He pressed upload. The silence that followed was not of defeat, but one of anticipation. The seed had been planted. Now it was time to see if it would grow.
The narrator's voice shifts to a new rhythm, one of acceleration and overwhelming noise. The quiet silence of Elijah's room was abruptly broken by the sound of 1,000 notifications, a cacophony of dings, pings, and rings. He had uploaded his video and fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, only to be woken by the digital world roaring to life. The first thing he saw was his phone screen, a brilliant white light in the dark. It was a flood, shares, likes, and comments pouring in faster than he could read them. The numbers climbed with an astonishing, relentless speed. The video of a young black man with his quiet dignity and heartfelt plea for community had struck a nerve. The comments weren't just praise, they were confessions of shared struggle, of quiet anxieties over bills and rising grocery prices. It was as if his single voice had become a megaphone for a million others. Elijah's world began to spin in a blur of activity. He was no longer just Elijah from the warehouse. He was the creator, the voice, the hope. He had traded the physical ache of moving boxes for the mental exhaustion of managing a burgeoning online community. The platform he had built, a simple website and a few social media pages, was a fragile home for a community that was growing exponentially, and he realized with a jolt that he needed to scale up. He needed real infrastructure, a better server, and a budget for marketing. He needed money. This is where the invisible villain, the system itself, appeared in a new, more sophisticated form. It was a different kind of barrier from the one that had kept him in a low-wage job. This barrier was polite, institutional, and just as impenetrable. His first step was to apply for a small business loan at a downtown bank. The building was a monument to wealth and power, all polished marble and silent security guards. He sat across from a loan officer with a warm but distant smile. Elijah explained his vision, the viral success of his video, the community he was building, and the need for capital to turn it into a sustainable enterprise. The loan officer listened patiently, nodding, but his eyes were on the numbers. He was looking at Elijah's credit score, his low income from his warehouse job, and his lack of collateral. He was looking at a history of economic racism that had made wealth accumulation for people like Elijah nearly impossible. The answer was no. The loan officer's polite refusal, delivered with a rehearsed sympathy, was just as brutal as Malik's bitter laughter. The message was clear. You can have a great idea, but the system isn't built for you to grow it into something real. The rejection was a tangible setback, a cold gust of wind that threatened to extinguish the fire in his eyes. He went home feeling the bitter taste of defeat, but this time it was different. He was no longer fighting alone. Amara, who had once been his biggest skeptic, saw the despair on his face. Without a word, she pulled up a chair and began looking at his website. She asked him about the monetization plan, about taxes. Her questions no longer tinged with fear, but with a fierce, protective pragmatism. Malik, who had initially called him foolish, now defended him in the comments section from trolls who accused him of being a fraud. He looked at Elijah and said simply, "We'll figure it out, man." The external struggle had, in a strange way, brought them together. The fight was no longer a solo journey. It was a collective one. The chapter ends with Elijah standing at a new precipice. The initial rise had been a triumph of will and hope, but the true struggle, the one that would define his success, was just beginning. It was a fight not only for a business, but for a new kind of freedom, one that the system was not willing to grant easily.
The narrator's voice settles, a calm after the storm, reflecting on the nature of true victory. A victory, he observes, isn't always a grand explosion of fireworks. Sometimes it's a quiet click, a simple notification on a screen that changes everything. For Elijah, the triumph arrived not from a bank, but from the very community he was building. A small news agency, having seen the viral video and the burgeoning community, reached out with an offer for a partnership, a way to help them monetize the platform through advertisements and sponsorships. It was a victory not against the system, but from within it, a small crack in the wall of a fortress that had seemed impenetrable. The numbers on his phone screen were real, tangible, and they were rising. It was the first time in his life that a number on a screen didn't represent a debt or a deficiency, but a genuine possibility. The weight he had carried for so long began to lift, and he felt a lightness in his chest he had never known before. He went to his mother's house, the one they had struggled to keep, and sat her down at the kitchen table. He showed her the numbers on his phone. She stared, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face a map of decades of unspoken worry. He told her she could stop working her second job. The words were a soft, gentle current that seemed to wash away her weariness, and for a moment he could have sworn her shoulders lost their tired slump. She didn't cry. She just took his hand, her touch surprisingly firm, and her quiet, grateful smile was more of a reward than any number. Later that week, he sat with Amara and Malik on the port swing. He explained the new partnership and the plans for the platform. Amara's arms were no longer crossed. She listened with an expression of intense focus, her pragmatism now channeled into brainstorming ideas for financial literacy workshops and community events. She saw the idea not as a fragile dream, but as a real, working business, and her fear had given way to a quiet, determined ambition of her own. Malik looked at him not with the bitterness of a man who had seen too many failures, but with the pride of a man who had seen his friend succeed against all odds. He confessed that he had been wrong to doubt him, and his words were not an apology, but a kind of healing. The three of them, once so separate in their individual fears, were now united by a shared purpose. The final triumph was not the money, but the purpose that money allowed him to fulfill. Elijah used his platform as a tool for collective empowerment. He created an online space not just for swapping goods, but for sharing resources, for connecting those who needed help with those who could give it. He began to organize job fairs and financial literacy classes, making sure that his community, once shackled by the invisible villain, had the tools to fight back. His story, told again and again in the media, became a symbol of a different kind of revenge, not against the people who doubted him, but against a system that had tried to tell them they were not worthy of success. The narrator closes, his voice a final reflective note. An abandoned idea, he muses, is never truly lost. It is a seed that lies dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right image, the right amount of pain and hope
to make it finally bloom. Elijah's story was not just about his journey, but about the power of a single person to inspire a whole community, to prove that hope, even in the bleakest of times, can be a force as real and tangible as the ground beneath your feet, and that the most powerful thing you can do when you have nothing else is to share your dream with someone else. For in their belief, your dream becomes real.